Meanwhile, President Trump is calling on the Senate right now to make 51 votes the thing for everything, from health care to the tax cuts to pretty much anything and everything. S&P Global President and CEO Doug Peterson testified on the Hill pushing tax reform. Let's go to this issue if we can, Doug, and very good to have you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Neil.
What do you make of that? Because then I wouldn't see any distinction with the Senate over the House, because obviously this is supposed to be the more earnest, deliberative body, and it might just be the House with 100 representatives rather than 435. What do you make of that?
Well, anything for being able to get tax reform underway would be valuable. Obviously, this is a theme that goes much broader than just tax reform. Maybe it's a way that the president is thinking about breaking the logjam of being able to get more of his agenda underway.
Do you think, though, that I thought the way things stood, the way they were structuring this deal, is that it would be a simple majority on the tax deal, I should say. Was it not, or what?
The way I understood it was being arranged was that they could handle the tax bill through reconciliation, which doesn't necessarily require the full 60 votes.
In other words, if they had their druthers, the president certainly had his druthers, it wouldn't be a matter of reconciliation or not, just...
It'd be an outright vote, from what I understand.
What do you think of that?
I think that right now, let me give you a couple of interesting statistics. In the recent Business Roundtable survey, 71% of the CEOs said that tax reform would be the way that you could see the fastest path to growth in the United States. After that, you had infrastructure investment and regulatory reform. But the business community is looking at tax reform as one of the most important tools to invest in innovation and growth in the United States, which also creates jobs. And having an agenda which is successful from Washington is also important to create confidence in the economy. So when it comes to changing the rules, I'm not an expert. I'm not a constitutional expert. I don't want to necessarily give you an opinion about 60 votes versus 51 votes. But getting an agenda that's going to build confidence in the economy, that's going to find ways to create jobs, all of that would be very positive.
You know, Doug, a lot of things that apparently they're having trouble with is paying for these tax cuts and finding offsets to them. Obviously, anytime you seek an offset or a way to pay for them, even though it's not all of them, it limits the bang for the tax-cutting buck, doesn't it?
Well, one of the things you have to look at, obviously, is a long-run view. And if you look at whether or not the tax reform would impact it over 1 year, 3 years, 10 years, there are ways that you should look at the impact of the tax cut to see what kind of growth it will create. What are some of the ways that we could eliminate certain subsidies? I call them subsidies because a lot of times deductions are a subsidy, and there's ways that our tax code has become so complicated. It's a couple thousand pages. It has actually literally hundreds of thousands of pages of interpretation. So in addition to lowering the rate and coming up with a territorial system, which are the things that I've been talking about, which would make us much more competitive on a global basis, having a simplified tax reform would also be valuable. And you could pay for some of the tax reform by the simplification and elimination of the subsidies.
Real quickly then, if it isn't big, in other words, isn't a substantial tax cut, if they have to cling to offsets or some ways, and it isn't so simple, wouldn't that limit its impact? I mean, wouldn't it be said, I mean, obviously for many people a tax cut is better than no tax cut, but a small or pale one could be just as bad as far as goosing this economy?
I think any tax cut is going to be seen as favorable. A larger tax cut with some sort of a territoriality system and simplification would be far superior. A couple of examples. We know that in the United Kingdom, they're lowering their tax rate from 19 to 17 by 2019. Canada lowered theirs to 26. Ireland is around 12.5. We have the highest tax rate of any major OECD country in the world at 35% and 39% if you take into account
but not everyone pays that, right?
Well, not everyone pays that. As an example, in our case, we pay between 30 and 32%. We book most of our revenue from the United States, even a lot of our offshore sales we book offshore, and that we also pay taxes in the U.S. for those. And you have a lot of companies, obviously, that are not. That's one of the reasons we have $2.5 trillion, actually more than that, in earnings that are being held offshore right now that have not not been repatriated. And that also creates another disadvantage for our economy with that much cash and capital that's sitting offshore that's not being brought back. In fact, the way the incentives works today, you would rather keep that cash offshore and ends up you invested offshore instead of bringing it back and investing in the U.S. So there's a lot of different ways that this tax reform could be beneficial to the economy. And it is complicated, but it is hard, but we'd love to see it get done.
All right. Doug Peterson, S&P Global President, CEO. Very good seeing you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Neil.